March 1943, 22,000 feet above occupied France. Hauptmann Hans Philipp, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated aces with over 200 kills, pulls his Focke-Wulf 190 into a tight turn. Through his canopy, he spots something that makes him smile. A massive American fighter, bloated and ungainly, lumbering toward him like a freight train with wings. The Germans have a nickname for it already. Der Jug, the milk jug. Fat. Slow. An easy kill. Philipp opens his throttle and dives to engage. What happens in the next 90 seconds will change his mind forever. And in the months to come, that change of heart will ripple through every Luftwaffe squadron from the Channel to Berlin. Because the aircraft Philipp is about to face isn't what it seems. It's 7 tons of American engineering fury wrapped in riveted aluminum. A fighter that shouldn't work according to every rule in the book, but somehow became the most produced American fighter of World War II. This is the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. A plane so heavy, pilots joked they didn't fly it, they wore it. So different from everything that came before that its own country doubted it. Yet it became the hammer that broke the Luftwaffe's back, the guardian angel that brought bombers home, and the ground attack monster that German soldiers learned to fear more than any other weapon in the sky. This is the story of how the plane that was mocked became the plane that mattered. To understand the Thunderbolt, you have to understand the world that birthed it. A world that had gotten fighter design completely wrong. 1939. Europe is at war, and America is watching nervously from across the ocean. The US Army Air Corps looks at the fighters dueling over France and draws all the wrong conclusions. They see the nimble Hurricane and Spitfire, the agile Messerschmitt 109, all weighing around 7,000 pounds, all dancing through the sky like lightweight boxers. The doctrine is clear. Fighters must be light, maneuverable, pure. Adding weight is sacrilege. Adding armor is cowardice. The pilot's skill should be his only protection. But in a cramped office in Farmingdale, Long Island, a brilliant and stubborn émigré from Soviet Georgia is about to tear up that entire playbook. Alexander Kartveli arrived in America in 1927, one step ahead of Stalin's purges, carrying nothing but his engineering degree and an unshakable belief that the rules of aircraft design were meant to be broken. By 1939, he's the chief engineer at Republic Aviation, and he's staring at a problem that's driving him mad. The Army wants a new fighter. They want it to fly at 40,000 feet, higher than any fighter has gone before. They want it heavily armed. They want it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. And they want it fast, faster than anything the Germans have. Oh, and it needs to be light. Kartveli does the math. The numbers don't lie. You can't have all those things with a light airframe. The new Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the most powerful radial engine in existence, weighs over a ton by itself. Add the turbocharger needed for high-altitude performance. Add guns. Add ammunition. Add fuel for range. Add armor to keep the pilot alive. The pencil keeps moving across his drafting table, and the weight keeps climbing. 7,000 pounds. 8,000. 9,000. 10,000. His colleagues think he's lost his mind. The Army specification calls for a fighter around 6,000 pounds. Kartveli's design is going to weigh nearly twice that. It will be the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. But Kartveli sees something no one else does. He sees that the war is changing. The lightweight dogfighters work beautifully over the English Channel, where fights last 5 minutes and home is always close. But America will have to fight over Germany itself, hundreds of miles of hostile territory where getting shot means death or capture, where the bombers will fly so high that current fighters gasp for air. In that world, weight isn't weakness. Weight is survival. So he doubles down. If the plane is going to be heavy, make it a juggernaut. Install not 6 guns but 8 .850 caliber machine guns with enough ammunition to fire for a full minute. Wrap the cockpit in armor plate that can stop a 20mm cannon shell. Put the pilot behind an 1.25 inch thick bulletproof windscreen. Build the airframe so strong it can dive faster than any fighter in existence. Make it a battering ram with wings. The Army is skeptical when Republic submits the design in June 1940. The XP-47B mock-up looks grotesque, a massive radial engine in front, a razorback fuselage behind it, and a bubble of a cockpit perched on top like an afterthought. It looks like it was designed by 3 different committees who never spoke to each other. But Europe is falling. France has collapsed. Britain stands alone. The Luftwaffe is pummeling cities into rubble. Suddenly, the old assumptions about lightweight fighters seem quaint. Maybe, just maybe, Kartveli is onto something. They give him the contract. May 6, 1941. Farmingdale Airfield, Long Island. Test pilot Lowry Brabham straps into the XP-47B prototype for its first flight. The cockpit sits 10 feet off the ground, higher than some pilots' second-story bedrooms. The engine in front of him is so enormous he can barely see over it. The whole contraption weighs 12,700 pounds fully loaded. For comparison, a Spitfire weighs 6,200 pounds. Brabham advances the throttle and the Pratt & Whitney R2800 bellows to life, 2,000 horsepower channeled through a 13-foot propeller. The noise is apocalyptic. The Thunderbolt lumbers down the runway. Slowly. Very slowly. Finally, reluctantly, it lifts off. And then something magical happens. The plane that looked like a brick begins to climb like a homesick angel. Brabham pushes it higher, 10,000 feet, 15,000, 20,000. The engine keeps pulling. At 25,000 feet, where most fighters are wheezing and struggling, the turbocharger kicks the engine into a second wind. 30,000 feet. 35,000. Brabham levels off at 40,000 feet, higher than Mount Everest, and the Thunderbolt is still flying strong. He pushes the stick forward and enters a dive. The airspeed indicator winds up like a broken clock, 300 miles per hour. 350, 400, 450, 500. At 550 miles per hour, Brabham pulls out, experiencing forces that would tear a lighter fighter to pieces. The Thunderbolt groans but holds together. Back on the ground, Brabham climbs out with a grin splitting his face. She's fast, he says. She's solid. And she's going to terrify people. He's right. But not in the way anyone expects. The first Thunderbolts begin rolling off the production line in early 1942, but they're plagued with problems. The massive engine runs too hot. The turbocharger is temperamental. The guns jam at high altitude. Worst of all, pilots hate it. They hate the weight. They hate the sluggish roll rate. They hate the terrible forward visibility blocked by that enormous engine. They come from flying P-40s and P-39s, nimble, responsive fighters that obey every input. The P-47 feels like wrestling a bank vault through the sky. The complaints flood in. It's a pig. It's a flying bathtub. This thing will get us killed. And across the Atlantic, as word reaches the Luftwaffe that America is building a massive radial engine fighter, the German pilots laugh. They've fought radial engine fighters before, lumbering ground attack planes and bombers. Easy meat. They're about to learn a very expensive lesson. April 8, 1943. Boxted Airfield, Essex, England. Captain Robert Johnson stands on the flight line, staring up at his P-47 Thunderbolt and wondering if he's going to die in it. Johnson is 22 years old, a farm boy from Oklahoma who joined the Army Air Corps with dreams of becoming a fighter pilot. Those dreams did not include flying 7 tons of American metal into combat against the most experienced fighter pilots in the world. The 56th Fighter Group, Johnson's unit, has just become operational. They've spent months training on the Thunderbolt, learning its quirks, its limitations, its terrifying peculiarities. Now they're about to escort B-17 bombers into occupied Europe, where the Luftwaffe is waiting. Johnson's squadron commander, a tough Texan named Hubert Zemke, has drilled one lesson into his pilots above all others. The Thunderbolt is not a dogfighter. Do not try to turn with the 109s and 190s. They'll eat you alive. Use your advantages: speed, dive, altitude. Hit fast, hit hard, and get out. Sound advice. But Johnson is about to discover that knowing what to do and doing it under fire are two very different things. The mission launches at 0900 hours. 56 Thunderbolts climb into the grey English sky, shepherding a stream of B-17s toward the shipyards at Antwerp, Belgium. It's Johnson's first combat mission. His hands are shaking so badly he can barely hold the stick. At 25,000 feet over the Belgian coast, the Luftwaffe arrives. They come out of the sun, Focke-Wulf 190s, the Luftwaffe's premier fighter, flown by veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. They see the American formation and immediately recognize the P-47s. The new planes. The untested planes. The fat planes. The 190s dive to attack expecting easy kills. What they get instead is a revelation in violence. The P-47s might be heavy, but that weight translates to momentum. When a Thunderbolt dives, it accelerates like a bullet. The Focke-Wulfs dive after them, but the Americans pull away, opening the distance. The German pilots push their throttles to the firewall, confused. Nothing outruns a 190 in a dive. Nothing. Johnson sees a 190 cross in front of him and squeezes the trigger. 850 caliber machine guns erupt simultaneously. The effect is catastrophic. The Germans are used to fighters with 2 or 4 guns, firing for a few seconds before running dry. The Thunderbolt fires a river of lead, 3,400 rounds per minute, that doesn't stop. The 190 disintegrates. Johnson stares, shocked by the sheer destructive power he's just unleashed. He's flown the plane for months, fired the guns on practice ranges, but nothing prepared him for this, the way the target simply ceased to exist. The dogfight swirls and fragments. Johnson makes a rookie mistake. He forgets Zemke's training and tries to turn with a 190. Instantly, he's in trouble. The Focke-Wulf turns inside him, getting angles, lining up a shot. Panic claws at Johnson's throat. He's about to die. Then instinct takes over. He shoves the stick forward and dives, straight down, full throttle. The Thunderbolt accelerates savagely. 400 miles per hour. 450, 500. The airframe shudders. Johnson's vision tunnels, but he's pulling away. The 109 pilot follows briefly, then breaks off. He's watched his airspeed indicator climb into the red zone. If he continues, his aircraft will tear itself apart. He watches, frustrated, as the American simply dives away from him. This is not supposed to happen. Johnson pulls out at 10,000 feet, his heart hammering, his flight suit soaked with sweat. He's alive. The Thunderbolt is intact, and he's just learned the most important lesson of his combat career. The Thunderbolt doesn't fight like other planes because it isn't other planes. The 56th Fighter Group returns to England having lost 2 aircraft, both to mechanical failures, not combat. They've claimed 8 German fighters destroyed. The Luftwaffe has lost veteran pilots, irreplaceable experience, and the word spreads through the German fighter squadrons like a cold wind. The American fighter is not what we thought. The Luftwaffe's intelligence service scrambles to understand what's happening. They interrogate captured P-47 pilots, examine crashed aircraft, compile reports. The picture that emerges is disturbing. The Americans have built a fighter that breaks every rule, and it works. It's too heavy to dogfight, so it doesn't dogfight. It uses speed and altitude as weapons. It climbs above you, dives through you, and escapes before you can react. Its pilot sits behind more armor than a tank commander. Its airframe can withstand G-forces that would crumple a Messerschmitt. And its guns, those 8 machine guns, can saw a fighter in half in a single burst. The Luftwaffe issues new tactical directives. Avoid diving combat with the P-47. Do not follow it into a dive. Engage it only when you have a clear altitude advantage. In other words, treat it with respect. Treat it with fear. But the Thunderbolt's real test is still coming. The 8th Air Force is planning something unprecedented. Daylight bombing raids deep into Germany itself. Not just to the coast, not just to France, but to Berlin. To the heart of the Reich. The bomber crews are terrified. They've been flying missions over occupied France, and even those short raids are costing them dearly. German fighters swarm them in waves, picking off stragglers, exploiting any gap in formation. The B-17 gunners fight back bravely, but they're outmatched. The bombers need fighter escorts for the entire mission, all the way to the target and back. Only one fighter has the range, the P-47 Thunderbolt. But there's a problem. Even with its massive fuel capacity, the P-47 can't reach Berlin. The round trip is over 1,100 miles. The Thunderbolt taps out at around 475 miles from base. The solution comes from an unlikely source. A civilian engineer named Benjamin Kelsey proposes external fuel tanks. disposable belly tanks that can be jettisoned when empty or when combat starts. It's not a new idea, but implementing it on the P-47 is a challenge. The plane already carries 305 gallons internally. Adding external tanks means redesigning fuel systems, testing new configurations, and retraining pilots. By the summer of 1943, P-47s start flying with 108-gallon drop tanks. Later, they'll carry 150-gallon tanks. Eventually, some will haul 300-gallon tanks, turning the fighter into a flying fuel depot. August 17, 1943. The 8th Air Force launches a massive raid, 376 B-17s targeting the Bull, bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. It's the deepest penetration into Germany yet. The P-47s will escort them as far as possible, then turn back, leaving the bombers to face the Luftwaffe alone for the final leg. Robert Johnson, now a battle-hardened veteran with 5 kills, leads his flight into Germany. At 28,000 feet, he watches the bombers below, silver fortresses in perfect formation, heading into hell. And then the Luftwaffe appears. Not in ones and twos, but in mass formations. 50 fighters. 70. 100. They're not just trying to shoot down bombers, they're trying to break the American will. They're sending a message: you cannot do this. The sky over Germany belongs to us. Johnson and his fellow P-47 pilots dive into the maelstrom. What follows is not a dogfight, but a rolling brawl stretching across 100 miles of sky. P-47s dive and climb, using their speed and altitude advantage to slash through German formations. The 850 calibers speak in devastating bursts. German fighters explode, tumble, burn. But the Americans are outnumbered. Johnson sees a bomber explode, 100 men dying in an instant. Another B-17 falls out of formation, streaming fire, dying slow. The sky fills with parachutes, white blossoms against blue, each one a man falling into captivity or death. Johnson's fuel gauge drops steadily. He's at the limit of his range. If he stays any longer, he won't make it home. Every P-47 pilot faces the same calculus: stay and protect the bombers, or turn back and survive. Most stay as long as they can. They fight until their ammunition is gone, until their fuel lights are blinking red warnings, until the very last possible second. Then they turn west, leaving the bombers to their fate, knowing that good men will die because they couldn't stay longer. 60 bombers don't come home from Schweinfurt and Regensburg. 600 men are dead or captured. It's a catastrophe. But here's what matters. Without the P-47s, it would have been worse. Far worse. The Thunderbolts shot down dozens of German fighters in the running battles over Europe. They disrupted German attacks, broke up formations, bought the bombers precious time. And the Luftwaffe commanders, reading their casualty reports that night, realized something chilling. The Americans are learning. The fat fighter is becoming dangerous. By late 1943, Robert Johnson has become one of the 8th Air Force's top aces. He's mastered the Thunderbolt, learned to use its strengths, compensate for its weaknesses. He flies with a confidence that borders on aggression. June 26, 1943, will test that confidence to its limits. Johnson is escorting bombers near Paris when he spots a lone Focke-Wulf 190 below him. Easy kill. He dives to attack. But it's a trap. The 190 is bait. 2 more German fighters drop out of the clouds behind him. Johnson realizes his mistake too late. The first burst hits his Thunderbolt like a sledgehammer, 20mm cannon shells punching through the tail, the fuselage, the wings. His canopy shatters. Metal fragments slash his face. The stick goes mushy. He tries to dive away, but the 190s stay with him, hammering his aircraft with burst after burst. His engine is hit. Smoke pours into the cockpit. His hydraulics fail. His rudder is shot to pieces. Johnson should be dead. Any other fighter would have disintegrated under this punishment. But the Thunderbolt holds together. The armor plate behind his seat stops a cannon shell that would have severed his spine. The bulletproof windscreen, crazed with cracks, deflects fragments. The massively over-engineered airframe absorbs damage that would down a lighter plane. The German pilots, frustrated and low on ammunition, finally break off. They've shot this American dozens of times. He should be dead. But he's still flying. Johnson nurses his dying Thunderbolt back across the channel. He can't raise his landing gear, the hydraulics are shot. His flaps are frozen. His engine is running rough, trailing smoke. He has no radio, no way to tell the tower he's in trouble. He lands gear up at his base, the Thunderbolt grinding across the runway in a shower of sparks, and finally skids to a halt. When the ground crew arrives, they count over 200 bullet and shell holes in Johnson's aircraft. The tail looks like cheese grater. The wings are shredded. The fuselage is perforated. One mechanic says quietly, "Nobody should have walked away from this." But Johnson did walk away. He climbed out, blood streaming from cuts on his face, and looked at his ruined aircraft with something approaching love. The plane that was supposed to be a pig, a bathtub, a flying death trap, it had saved his life. Johnson will survive the war with 27 kills, one of America's top aces. He'll fly the Thunderbolt for his entire combat tour, refusing transfers to other aircraft. Years later, when asked why, he'll say simply, "The jug brought me home. Every time. I owed it my life." He wasn't alone in that sentiment. By early 1944, the war in the air over Europe has reached a crisis point, but not for the Allies. The Luftwaffe is dying. Not from lack of aircraft. German factories are still producing fighters at a remarkable rate. Not from lack of fuel, not yet. The Luftwaffe is dying from attrition. Every day, experienced pilots climb into their cockpits and don't come back. They're shot down by the swarms of American fighters that now penetrate deep into the Reich. They're killed by their own mistakes, by mechanical failures, by bad luck and good shooting. And they're not being replaced fast enough. The Luftwaffe's training pipeline has collapsed. New pilots arrive at frontline squadrons with barely 50 hours of flight time, facing Americans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. It's not a fair fight. It's a slaughter, and nowhere is that more evident than in the increasing domination of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 has evolved. Engineers have fixed the early problems, improved the engine cooling, refined the turbocharger, solved the gun jamming issues. Pilots have learned its secrets, developed tactics that play to its strengths. And production has ramped up to an incredible scale. Republic's Farmingdale plant and a massive new facility in Evansville, Indiana, are churning out Thunderbolts at a rate of over 1,000 per month. But the most important evolution is strategic. The 8th Air Force commanders have realized something profound. The P-47 isn't just an escort fighter. It's a multi-role weapon that can do things no other aircraft can. Its rugged construction makes it ideal for ground attack. Its 850 caliber guns can shred locomotives, trucks, tanks. Its ability to absorb punishment means it can fly low into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire and survive. So a new mission profile is born. Fighter-bomber sweeps. P-47s loaded with bombs and rockets, hunting targets of opportunity across occupied Europe. The Germans call these missions Jabos, fighter bombers, and they learn to fear them above all else. Major Francis Gabby Gabreski typifies the new breed of Thunderbolt pilot. A coal miner's son from Pennsylvania, Gabreski has risen through the ranks to become the commanding officer of the 61st Fighter Squadron. He's credited with 28 aerial victories, making him one of the top American aces in Europe. But Gabreski's real impact isn't measured in aerial kills. It's measured in railroads destroyed, convoys obliterated, airfields cratered. March 1944. Gabreski leads his squadron on a sweep over northern France. Their mission: disrupt German transportation networks ahead of the coming Allied invasion. They fly at 200 feet, hedge-hopping across the French countryside, looking for targets. Gabreski spots a freight train. A long one, probably carrying supplies to the Atlantic Wall defenses. He radios his formation and they drop lower, setting up for a strafing run. The 850 caliber guns in Gabreski's P-47 open fire, and the effect is apocalyptic. The heavy machine gun rounds punch through the locomotive's boiler, causing a catastrophic explosion. Steam and shrapnel erupt. The following cars derail, accordion into each other, spill their contents across the tracks. In 20 seconds, Gabreski has destroyed a week's worth of German logistics. His squadron moves on, hunting. They find a convoy of trucks. More targets destroyed. A fuel depot. A communication station. A bridge. By the time they return to England, they've left a trail of devastation across 50 miles of French countryside. And they've barely used half their ammunition. This becomes the pattern. Day after day, Thunderbolt squadrons range across Europe, smashing everything that moves. The Germans try to defend. They deploy more anti-aircraft guns, fly more fighter patrols, establish better warning systems. It doesn't matter. The Thunderbolts keep coming. From the German perspective, the situation is becoming nightmarish. Every supply convoy risks annihilation from the air. Every train that moves in daylight is a target. The Allies have achieved something the Luftwaffe never managed over Britain. Air superiority so complete that the enemy cannot move without permission. German soldiers on the ground develop a visceral fear of the P-47. When they hear the sound of its big radial engine, they dive for cover. They've seen what happens when a Thunderbolt catches a column in the open. The Luftwaffe tries to respond. They develop new tactics, high-altitude ambushes, dawn and dusk attacks when visibility favors the defender. Some work, briefly. But the Americans adapt faster, learn quicker, have more aircraft and pilots to spend. The exchange rate is brutal. For every P-47 shot down, the Germans lose 3 or 4 fighters. And while America can replace those losses in weeks, Germany takes months. One German pilot, Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, writes in his diary about an encounter with P-47s in April 1944. We attacked what we thought was a vulnerable formation of bombers. Then the Thunderbolts came down on us like avenging angels. We lost 6 aircraft in as many minutes. The American pilots are not just skilled, they're systematic. They don't take chances. They use their speed to control the engagement, hit us when we're vulnerable, disengage when we try to fight back. It's like fighting a machine that's been programmed to kill us. Knoke's observation is astute. By mid-1944, the Americans have systematized aerial combat. They've developed standard tactics, standard responses to every situation. Where the Germans rely on individual brilliance, their aces pulling off spectacular maneuvers, the Americans rely on teamwork, discipline, and the raw capabilities of their aircraft. And chief among those aircraft is the Thunderbolt. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The invasion of Normandy is the largest amphibious assault in history, and it depends absolutely on Allied air supremacy. If the Luftwaffe can strike the landing beaches, the invasion could fail. If German reinforcements can move freely to Normandy, they might throw the Allies back into the sea. The Luftwaffe must be stopped. German transportation must be paralyzed. Enter the Thunderbolt. On D-Day, the 8th and 9th Air Forces fly over 3,000 fighter sorties, the vast majority by P-47s. They patrol the beaches, preventing German air attacks. They strafe roads and railways, stopping reinforcements. They bomb bridges, cutting off escape routes. The Luftwaffe launches around 300 sorties against the invasion, a pittance. Most never reach the beaches. Those that do are swarmed by Allied fighters. By nightfall on June 6th, the Luftwaffe has lost over 100 aircraft and achieved nothing. The invasion is secure, and the P-47 played a crucial role. But the cost is mounting. Thunderbolt pilots are flying multiple missions per day, pushing themselves and their aircraft to the limit. Losses, while relatively light compared to the Germans, are still losses. Young men still die. Colonel Hubert Zemke, the legendary commander who transformed the 56th Fighter Group into the most effective P-47 unit in Europe, is shot down in October 1944 and spends the rest of the war as a POW. Gabi Gabreski, trying to squeeze in one more mission before his combat tour ends, crashes on landing at a German airfield he's just strafed and spends the rest of the war in a prison camp. The Thunderbolt can bring you home, but it can't make you invincible. By late 1944, a new American fighter has arrived in Europe, the P-51 Mustang. With its laminar flow wings and liquid-cooled engine, the Mustang is lighter, sleeker, more elegant than the brutish Thunderbolt. It has better range, better high-altitude performance, and, crucially, better maneuverability. The 8th Air Force begins transitioning squadrons from P-47s to P-51s, especially for long-range escort duties. The Mustang becomes the glamour fighter, the aircraft that escorts bombers all the way to Berlin and beyond. But the P-47 doesn't disappear. Instead, it's redeployed to the role it's best suited for, ground attack. The 9th Air Force, supporting the ground troops advancing across France and into Germany, operates almost exclusively Thunderbolts. And in this role, the P-47 becomes legendary. German soldiers in 1944 and 45 face a terror unlike anything previous generations experienced. It's not the enemy they can see, the tanks and infantry they can fight. It's the enemy that comes from above, without warning, and against which they have no defense. P-47 pilots flying ground attack missions develop a fearsome reputation. They're not bombing from 30,000 feet impersonal and distant. They're down at treetop level, close enough to see the faces of the men they're killing. Close enough to draw return fire from every rifle and machine gun. They carry a terrifying array of weapons. 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, 500-pound bombs, napalm, and those 850 caliber machine guns that never seem to run dry. A Thunderbolt attacking a German column doesn't just damage it, it obliterates it. Trucks explode, scatter like toys. Tanks, hit by rockets, brew up with their ammunition cooking off. Soldiers run, desperately seeking cover, and the Thunderbolt follows them, guns blazing. It's brutal, personal, merciless. And it's breaking the German army's ability to function. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, said. Catching the Allies by surprise, German forces punched through the American lines in the Ardennes forest, creating a dangerous bulge in the Allied front. For several days, bad weather grounds Allied aircraft. The Germans advance rapidly, their columns moving in daylight without fear of air attack. American ground forces fight desperately, outnumbered and outgunned. Then, on December 23rd, the weather clears, and the Thunderbolts come. For 3 days, P-47s from the 9th Air Force fly continuous missions over the Bulge. They attack in waves, one squadron after another, giving the Germans no respite. Every road becomes a killing ground. Every concentration of troops and vehicles becomes a target. The German offensive grinds to a halt, not because it's been defeated on the ground, but because it can't be supplied. The Thunderbolts have severed every supply line, destroyed every fuel depot, smashed every reinforcement column. German soldiers, freezing in the snow, look up at the sky with hatred and helplessness. Those big radial engines, that distinctive sound, it means death is coming, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. The Battle of the Bulge is Germany's last gasp. After it fails, the Reich's defeat is only a matter of time. And when historians analyze why the offensive failed, air power ranks near the top of the list, specifically the relentless ground attacks by Allied fighters. Specifically the P-47 Thunderbolt. Spring 1945, the Third Reich is collapsing. Soviet forces are closing on Berlin from the east. American and British forces are driving into Germany from the west. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, has been reduced to scattered remnants. A few hundred operational fighters manned by boys and old men flying on fumes. The P-47 Thunderbolt is everywhere. By the end of the war in Europe, over 15,600 Thunderbolts have been built. They've flown over 546,000 combat sorties. They've destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, 3,052 in the air and 3,015 on the ground. They've obliterated 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. But numbers don't capture what the Thunderbolt meant to the men who flew it, or the men who faced it. Let's return to where we began. Hauptmann Hans Philipp, the Luftwaffe ace who initially dismissed the P-47 as der Jug, the fat milk bottle. By late 1943, Philipp's tone has changed completely. He's seen too many of his comrades fall to the American fighters. He's felt the frustration of watching P-47s dive away from him at speeds his Focke-Wulf can't match. He's witnessed the devastating firepower of 850 calibers concentrated on a single target. In his final combat report, filed weeks before his death in October 1943, Philipp writes a warning to his fellow pilots: the Americans have learned to use their fighter properly. They do not engage in turning combat. They dive, attack with overwhelming firepower, and escape using their superior speed. Their pilots are well trained and disciplined. The P-47 is no longer a target, it is a threat. Treat it accordingly, or you will not survive. Philipp himself doesn't survive. He's shot down by P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group, possibly by Robert Johnson over the North Sea. His body is never recovered. One of the Luftwaffe's greatest aces, credited with 206 victories, killed by the fighter he once mocked. The story of the P-47 and the Luftwaffe is ultimately a story about adaptation and arrogance. The Germans entered the war with the world's most experienced fighter pilots, flying excellent aircraft, backed by sophisticated tactics developed in Spain and Poland. They assumed this advantage was permanent. But warfare is evolution accelerated. The Americans came late to the fight, with inferior aircraft and inexperienced pilots. They lost badly at first, but they learned. They adapted. They built better planes and developed better tactics. And crucially, they had the industrial capacity to iterate rapidly, to build thousands of aircraft, lose hundreds learning, and still come back stronger. The Thunderbolt embodied that philosophy. It was a brute force solution to air combat. Just build a fighter so tough, so powerful, so heavily armed that skill becomes less important than raw capability. Was it elegant? No. The Spitfire was elegant. The Mustang was elegant. The Thunderbolt was a sledgehammer. But when you're trying to break down a door, a sledgehammer is exactly what you need. One pilot's story captures the strange relationship men developed with the Thunderbolt. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Basler commanded the 395th Fighter Group in Italy, flying P-47s against the Luftwaffe over southern Europe. Basler loved the Thunderbolt, trusted it completely. In his entire combat tour, he never had a mechanical failure, never had his aircraft fail to bring him home despite taking significant battle damage on multiple occasions. In late 1944, his group transitions to P-51 Mustangs. Basler is thrilled. The Mustang is faster, more maneuverable, has better range. It should be superior in every way. On his third mission in a Mustang, Basler is hit by flak over Austria. A single shell fragment punctures his cooling system. Glycol coolant sprays across his windscreen. The temperature gauge climbs rapidly. Within minutes, his engine seizes. He barely makes it back to friendly territory before bailing out. Later, recovering from minor injuries, Basler admits to a friend, "In a Thunderbolt, I'd have made it home. That big radial engine could take hits that would kill a liquid-cooled engine. I felt safe in the jug. Invincible, almost. The Mustang is a beautiful aircraft, but I never felt that way in it." This sentiment echoes through countless pilot memoirs. The P-47 wasn't loved for its beauty or grace. It was loved because it brought men home. It was loved because when everything went wrong, when you were hit, when you were lost, when you were alone over enemy territory with a damaged aircraft, the Thunderbolt gave you a chance. That's not a small thing. That's everything. After the war in Europe ends in May 1945, many Thunderbolts are shipped to the Pacific, where they serve with distinction in the final months against Japan. Others are given to Allied air forces, the British, French, Brazilians, Mexicans, Soviets. Some remain in American service for years, flying in the Korean War before finally being retired. But the real legacy of the P-47 isn't measured in service life or kill ratios. It's measured in the fundamental shift it represents in how we think about fighter aircraft. Before the Thunderbolt, the prevailing wisdom said fighters must be light and agile above all else. The P-47 proved that wrong. It showed that survivability matters, that firepower matters, that the ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting matters just as much as maneuverability. Modern fighter design owes more to the Thunderbolt than most people realize. The F-15 Eagle, one of the most successful fighters ever built, follows the Thunderbolt's philosophy: big, powerful, heavily armed, and nearly indestructible. The A-10 Warthog, beloved by ground troops for its ability to survive catastrophic damage and keep flying, is a direct spiritual descendant of the P-47. Even modern multi-role fighters, like the F-35, prioritize survivability and versatility over pure dogfighting ability. Alexander Kartveli's radical idea that a fighter could be heavy and still effective changed everything. He saw past the conventional wisdom of his era and designed an aircraft for the war that was coming, not the war that had been. That kind of forward thinking, that willingness to challenge every assumption, is rare. It's also what wins wars. But there's a darker thread running through this story, one we shouldn't ignore. The Thunderbolt was phenomenally effective at what it did. And what it did, especially in those final months of the war, was kill. Not just shoot down enemy fighters in honorable combat, but strafe columns of retreating soldiers, incinerate supply trucks, destroy trains that might have been carrying wounded men or civilians. The pilots who flew these missions weren't monsters. They were young men doing what they were ordered to do, fighting a war they believed was just against an enemy that had started one of history's most destructive conflicts. But the experience haunted some of them. One P-47 pilot, whose name has been lost to history, wrote in a letter home in March 1945, "We caught a German column on the road today. They had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. We made pass after pass until nothing was moving. When we flew over afterwards, I looked down and saw what we'd done. I'm told this is necessary, that every German soldier we kill here is one less that American soldiers will face on the ground. I believe that. I have to believe that. But I also have to live with what I've seen. War is never clean. The Thunderbolt, for all its engineering brilliance and the courage of the men who flew it, was ultimately a tool of violence. An extraordinarily effective tool, yes, one that helped end a war that needed to end, that helped defeat a regime that deserved to be defeated. But still a tool of violence. That complexity deserves acknowledgement. We can admire the aircraft, honor the pilots, recognize the strategic necessity, and still be sobered by what war demands of human beings. There's one more story worth telling, a small moment that captures something essential about the P-47 and the men who flew it. May 8, 1945. VE Day. The war in Europe is over. At bases across England and France, Thunderbolt pilots gather to celebrate. There's drinking, singing, relief and grief all mixed together. They've survived. So many others didn't. At one base, a group of pilots from the 56th Fighter Group decide to give their Thunderbolts a proper send-off. They take off in formation, 50 P-47s climbing into the evening sky over England. At 10,000 feet, they begin a series of victory rolls. Not the wild aerobatics of lighter fighters, but the slow, powerful rolls of the Thunderbolt, each aircraft revolving around its axis with ponderous grace. People on the ground stop what they're doing to watch. They've heard these engines for years now, the sound that meant protection, that meant somebody was fighting for them. Now it means something else. It's over. We won. The Thunderbolts climb higher, formation tightening, and then they dive. All 50 of them, diving toward the earth at speeds that make the air scream. At 5,000 feet they pull out, the G-forces crushing the pilots into their seats, the airframes groaning, but holding together as they always have. Then they turn west, formation intact, and fly toward the setting sun. It's purely symbolic. They'll circle back and land in 20 minutes. But in that moment, it feels like an ending. Like these machines, built for war, are finally being released from their purpose. Robert Johnson is flying in that formation. He'll later say it was the best flight of his life. Not because of any combat action, not because of the thrill of victory, but because for once he was flying the Thunderbolt without fear, without scanning the sky for enemies, without calculating fuel and ammunition. Just flying. Just feeling the power of that massive engine, the solidity of that airframe, the connection between man and machine that war had forged. "The Jug and I had an understanding," he wrote years later. "I trusted it completely, and it never let me down. On that last flight, I wanted to say thank you." I don't know if that sounds crazy, but that's what it was. Thank you for keeping me alive. Thank you for bringing me home. It doesn't sound crazy at all. It sounds human. And humanity, messy, complicated, imperfect humanity, is what this story is really about. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a machine, yes. Steel and aluminum, rivets and hydraulics, engineering and mathematics made tangible. But it was also something more. It was a lifeline for men flying into hell. A shield for bombers trying to complete their missions. A hammer that helped break the back of the most evil regime in modern history. It was mockery transformed into respect. Doubt transformed into trust. Weakness revealed as strength. The Germans learned to fear it, but that fear came from understanding. They understood too late that the Americans had built something special. Not beautiful, not graceful, but effective in ways that beauty and grace could never be. They understood that the rules they thought governed aerial combat were being rewritten, and they couldn't rewrite them fast enough. And perhaps most importantly, they understood that their enemy had learned. The Americans who arrived in 1942 were amateurs. The Americans of 1944 were professionals. And the tool they used to make that transformation was the Thunderbolt. Today, only a handful of P-47s still fly. They appear at air shows, beautifully restored, their engines roaring with the same authority they had 80 years ago. Crowds gather to watch them, to hear that distinctive sound, to see the massive fighters lumber into the sky and then, surprisingly, dance. Most people who watch don't know the stories. They don't know about Robert Johnson nursing his shattered aircraft home. They don't know about Gabi Gabreski destroying a train in 20 seconds. They don't know about the German soldiers who dove for cover at the sound of that engine, or the bomber crews who looked up and saw the Thunderbolts arriving and knew they might actually survive the day. But some know. Veterans and children of veterans, and history enthusiasts who've read the books and studied the records. They know what the Thunderbolt meant, what it cost, what it achieved. And when that big radial engine starts, when that massive propeller begins to turn, when 7 tons of American engineering lifts impossibly into the air, they remember. They remember that sometimes the right tool for the job isn't the one everyone expects. Sometimes it's the one that breaks all the rules. Sometimes it's the one that everyone doubts until it proves them wrong. They remember that wars are won not just by courage and skill, though both matter enormously. They're won by logistics, by production capacity, by the ability to learn from mistakes and adapt faster than the enemy. They remember that survival matters, that bringing people home matters, that the ugly practical solution that works is better than the beautiful elegant solution that fails. And they remember the men, the pilots who climbed into those cramped cockpits day after day, knowing the odds, knowing what could happen, and doing it anyway because it needed to be done. The pilots who learned to love an aircraft that wasn't supposed to be lovable, who found grace in its power and beauty in its strength. The Thunderbolt doesn't need defending. Its record speaks for itself. 636 built, 546,000 sorties flown, thousands of young men brought home alive who wouldn't have been in lesser aircraft, a war shortened perhaps by months, tens of thousands of lives saved because bombers had protection, because ground troops had close air support, because the Luftwaffe couldn't maintain air superiority against an opponent that simply wouldn't break. That's the legacy. Not perfection, not elegance, not mythical invincibility. Just effectiveness. Just results. Just a machine that did what it was built to do, against all expectations, and did it so well that the very people who mocked it came to fear it. In the end, perhaps that's all any weapon of war can hope to be. Effective enough to end the fighting sooner, rugged enough to bring its users home, and important enough to be remembered not for what it destroyed, but for what it protected. The P-47 Thunderbolt. The plane German pilots first mocked, then feared, and finally respected. The plane that shouldn't have worked but did. The plane that proved sometimes the heaviest fighter is the one that hits hardest and lasts longest.